This is about one of those famous quotes in wrestling history, Jim. Daddy said sell. Really happened or urban legend?
With the inflection and the verbatim quote that it is said in all those retellings of the stories by people from the Tennessee territory, it wasn't said exactly that way, but the root of that story is correct. Nick Gulas had broken his son George into the wrestling business. He started making referee appearances in 1973, and he'd been doing announcing, and here you had a guy with a second generation Greek accent who also couldn't talk plain doing wrestling commentary. But then he became a special referee a couple times, and then finally in very early 1974 it was time to make George a wrestler, and they pushed him in the main events from the start because his father was convinced that because of his tenure as an announcer and his last name and it's George, that the people would accept him. And in those days, and it's George. I mean, in Nashville now, back when the studio wrestling show was live after the late news on like Saturday night or whatever, and went off at 11 o'clock back in those days or whatever, Nick would sign off the show saying, "I want to say goodnight to my son, George. Go to bed, Georgie." And this was back in the fucking 50s, right? So that people in Nashville had grown up with George. The people that got him in Louisville in 1974, when they'd been used to Jackie Fargo and Don and Al Green, they didn't quite get George Gulas that much. But anyway, so he becomes a wrestler, and Nick put him with all the top baby faces as tag team partners. One time the 6-man world champions were Jackie Fargo, Jerry Jarrett, and George Gulas. Or the NWA United States 6-man champions were George Gulas, Dennis Hall, and Bearcat Brown. Any popular baby faces he'd team up with. They'd get, he'd make saves for people. Nick pushed, that's one of the reasons why he put him together with Bobby Eaton as a tag team by 77, 78, the Jet Set, because Bobby was so phenomenal, he could sell and work the whole match, and then George could make the hot tag, make a comeback, and clean house on everybody. But I mean, it had been just going on, and finally they brought Harley Race into Nashville, and I believe this was in 1978. Bobby was there, if I'm not mistaken, because we've talked about it. And Harley Race was obviously the traveling world champion heel, and George Gulas was supposed to be the local hero babyface that would challenge him. NWA, it's the only world title match George Gulas ever had, to my knowledge. And Harley Race had been in and out of the territory, and I'm sure he knew what he was in for, but they had to go, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe Garen Shea or Scott Teal, if he's listening, could – and one of his books would easily remedy this, but I think they had to go an hour Broadway because Nick didn't want Harley to beat George. Yeah. And according to what Bobby Eaton told me, also, the match was so bad and the people got so fucking mad at George that they started booing him and cheering Harley Race. And that I believe, and somebody's got to, Scott Teal has to weigh in on this, or somebody from Nashville, because I believe that George was so mad that at the fans booing him, the ones that were, I mean, everybody, it didn't just suddenly turn and they booed him out, but there was a bunch of people getting on George Gulas's ass at that time. And he got out and got in a scuffle and started swinging at the fucking fans that had been hooting him down. And it was a horrible fucking night. But during the course of the match, and I mean, and George's shit looked so weak. And he just looked so physically he was 6'6", but like 220 pounds, but no visible muscles or definition of anything. And so he was so skinny and lanky and kind of awkward. And he threw forehand chops, but with a little, almost a limp wristed chop throw. I don't know how to explain it. And so at one point during the match, the legend has been, and I'm sure Harley has perpetuated it some too, that George, during the course of it, when Harley was getting kind of fed up with, Daddy said sail, Daddy said sail. And that kind of is how George talked, but it was probably knowing that George was also a polite young man and never realized why he had the heat he had or what he was doing. It's probable that George said something like, "My daddy said you'd sell for me, please." But I mean, Bobby said one time they took one of the first road trips they took with George. Every time they stopped to take a piss or a beer stop or get food or whatever, he called the office and talked to Nick. And of course, George didn't obviously have to wrestle for money either, because Nick at the time, he'd been the wrestling promoter in Nashville since the early 40s. A couple years before he went out of business, Nick Gulas had a brand new office building built in Nashville for $200,000 and paid cash for it. I'm not talking writing a check out of his account. I'm talking took the cash out of the fucking safe. That was a well-known story too. So he had places, but George, while the guys were getting bologna sandwiches or trying to, paying each other the 5 cents a mile trance or whatever, because that's all they could afford. George is, and they're getting their beer after the matches. George was on the payphone to Nick again at home this time going, "Yeah, Daddy, and now we're stopping and we're having a picnic. We're having sandwiches." It was like, he didn't get it.
Robert Fuller just told me, because I had him on the Super Studcast with him and Ron, and he said that it was like, Nick would say, "Would you drive Georgia to the show?" And it's, "Oh, sure." All right. And midway, there's his favorite hot dog place is there. You have to stop there, get him a hot dog. And Nick would basically treat the wrestlers like a taxi service. Sure, they were working, but they were going to make George's stops along the way.
So they could have a picnic. Good Daddy said sell.
All right.
And one more thing for the new, because we have so many new listeners. The reason why that Jerry Jarrett split from Nick Gulas in 1977, leading to Nick losing the wrestling business after almost 40 years, actually, I think 40 years exactly in Nashville, was that there were two territories in the Nashville booking office area. There was the Memphis end that Jarrett he took over the book in Memphis, and he'd created Louisville and Evansville and Lexington. And there was Nashville, Chattanooga, Birmingham, and Huntsville that Nick had for 35 years. And one day Nick came to Jerry Jarrett and said, "I think it's time that George comes over to the Memphis end." And Jerry said, "Well, that's not going to happen, because I've seen what he's done to your business, and I don't want him to do it to mine." And Jarrett at that point also had been led to believe by Nick and his attorney that he owned a piece of the entire office and had put money toward that, and found out that was not the case, and resigned from the company. And in the next 6 weeks took all of Nick's wrestlers, the TV in Memphis, Jerry Lawler, Lance Russell, the whole 9 yards, and left Nick with Nashville, Huntsville, Birmingham, and Chattanooga, which in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had been a license to print money, towns drawing 4,000 or 5,000 people a week. And 3 years later, with George on top, Nick was basically out of business, and Jarrett was giving him a mercy payoff to take over those towns, or take over a couple of them, because Nick had lost a couple of them by then.
When George debuted, wasn't he actually called George Nick Gulas?
Actually, this is another thing. No, on TV he never was, but the first publicity pictures he had taken, which numbered in the dozens, he had, as soon as, I'm serious, he started having every picture with every top baby face and himself and every part of whatever. It flooded the tables. But they called him George Gulas on television, whether it's your referee George Gulas or the announcer, "I'm George Gulas." But Nick insists on having George Nick Gulas put on the caption on his publicity photos, just to make sure everybody knew that he was the son of that Nick Gulas, and so he had to be over. It was bizarre. George Nick Gulas.